Well, what a fantastic job, Fernando, without the slides. I am indeed from the marketing department, but I assure you that I'm not going to try to sell you a door for $1.4 million. Instead, I am a researcher of digital economy, digital media, and I wanted to share with you some of our findings, some of our learnings from looking at communication through new technological channels, social media in particular. So, and some of you, of course, being here miles and miles away from Philadelphia and graduating many years ago, you thought that you were spared from the questions, the cold calling that we do so often, we love to do, right, at Wharton. But I'd like to start my talk with a question. So let's take you back to this morning. If you can recall, think about the first thing you did in the morning as you woke up. I'll give you 10 seconds to try to collect your thoughts. Okay, I hope everyone has an idea. So if you're like the majority of the American adults, if you're like most US adults, about 61%, probably before you woke up, you gave a hug to your spouse, you said good morning to your children, or you brewed that first cup of coffee to feel more awake, you actually reached out to your device, your phone, and you probably checked your emails, and you probably also looked at your social media. And in fact, if you're like the majority of the adults, probably that was also the last thing you did before you went to bed the night before. We are not only looking at social media as we wake up, as we go to bed, but we are also obtaining a lot of information about products, about brands, about people to look up to through social media. More than 70% of the US adults are receiving this information when they're making decisions. Right, so, and of course, brands and political figures are so aware of the fact that we are collecting information through social media, and they are increasingly more and more present through these places, whether it's the athletes, whether it's politicians, whether it's brands, right? They are increasingly more choosing to communicate with us through these means. But if you're also a skeptic of social media, like I am, right, you might ask this question. You might say, well, are those reactions and the activity that we have on social media, does it amount to anything real? Right? Does it matter? Does it do anything in real life? And indeed, right, it's the question as a researcher that I also was interested in with my co-authors. And I wanted to measure that. I wanted to see if the communication that we have on social media can amount to something in real world, and if there are differences across individuals who are choosing to communicate, and if there are differences across the communication styles. So one of the things, of course, you can think about is there are many different outcomes of communicating through social media. A brand could look at the sales that they experience. A brand could look at the brand awareness that they create. A public figure could be looking at the sentiment towards them. Politicians could be looking at the political support that they generate. And indeed, right, we could be choosing to look at many of these outcomes. But as researchers, as pragmatic researchers who want to nail down cause and effect, we decided to look at politicians as public figures and the support that they generate on social media as an outcome. So we wanted to study this particular outcome. But even then, right, when you think about politics, there are many different things that you could be looking at as an outcome. There's this golden goose of voting. But if I'm a researcher, if I want to look at politics or political campaigns and communication that take over a number of years and look at the outcome of voting, that's usually not a very credible way of making claims in terms of causal effects. I could look at people who are potentially going out and talking and acting on behalf of politicians, but that's very hard to observe. But in countries like the United States and many other parts of the world, one of the ways through which you can measure and calculate perhaps or capture political support or influence is through donations. Especially small donations from ordinary individuals can make a significant difference in terms of the success of a politician. And even though they are so small, right, $25, $50, they are so small to make a pivotal change in the outcome of an election, they are quite symbolic. They're quite symbolic in the sense that they become a symbol of a belief, of a desire to help a politician to become successful. So that's what we wanted to focus on. On the practical side, they're also very well documented in the United States. You have lots of data that enables us, again, to nail this cause and effect relationship. So that's what we decided to do in this particular paper. We wanted to look at the gains from political communication to be able to, again, understand what makes someone successful, and can we learn from those potential communication styles as well. And when we were carrying out this exercise, of course, as you all know, there are millions of figures that are just who are potentially communicating on social media, but there are a few of them who are quite successful with lots of followers. And we didn't only want to look at those people. We wanted to look at the small-town politicians as well, right? So we looked at over 800 politicians, and we wanted to understand if there are differences across the new politicians and the experienced politicians in terms of the gains that they obtain from social media. So before I dive into the results, I want to sort of convince you through a figure. So here on the x-axis, I'm going to show you the timeline around a politician starting to adopt a platform like Twitter, currently rebranded as X, as many of you know. So this line is going to indicate the timeline of adopting essentially political communication through Twitter. And what I'm going to look at is the support of a politician before they adopt Twitter and how that changes after they adopt. Now here, an exercise that we can do, if we think that social media does anything, right? Compare the regions where social media communication is more influential to the regions where social media communication is not very influential, because presumably, if information is consumed, it's going to make a greater difference. So on the red dots, I'm going to show you regions where Twitter communication is fairly high, and on the blue dots, I'm going to show you regions where Twitter penetration or usage is fairly low. So what would we expect, right? Before a politician adopts Twitter communication, there should not be a difference in terms of the support that a politician generates, and that's exactly what we see in the results. But if they adopt Twitter, and if Twitter does something, we should start to see something changing in the amount of donations that they are able to generate, and presumably this effect should be greater in regions where, again, Twitter is in greater use, and that's exactly what we observe. Right? So without going into any technical details, any equations, any tables, hopefully this figure is able to communicate to you the main finding that we have, which is it seems like that communication through these new channels seem to make a difference for at least the public personas who are politicians. And at the same time, right, if you try to look at the magnitude of this effect, what we find is that this is about 1% to 2% of what a politician could generate over a 2-year campaign period. But this is not the most important or most interesting result. What seems to be most important is when we compare newcomers, political newcomers, new politicians, those entrants, to the experienced politicians, perhaps, again, against against the intuition, what we see is that new politicians are able to garner greater support compared to the experienced ones. And you see this result now replicated over a number of different areas. Lynn has done a research also on this one. We see the same result when we look at markets, when we look at commercial products, when we look at entrepreneurs. It seems like small players, right, those underprivileged players, underdogs, they're able to generate a greater gain through adopting this communication compared to the incumbents, compared to the experienced players. Why does that happen? And why is this important? Based on our analysis, at least, what we have seen is that when new players come into the marketplace, there's very little information about these individuals, whereas the experienced players, they're already known. There's very little new things that they can communicate, even if they can adopt a new communication channel. So that creates this balance, because they're at different parts of the learning curve. But at the same time, this finding is important, because oftentimes, incumbents, early entrants, right? They are able to garner lots of resources to their advantage to be able to create a competitive advantage that's typically sustainable. If we can create these new communication channels that do not require big resources, big funds for new players, new brands, new personas to come into the marketplace, potentially we can reduce or maybe even reverse incumbency advantage, and we can create more competitive markets. So that's the main takeaway that we at least like from our research. But you might ask this question, right? Can I just open an account and can I start just putting any content and should that benefit me? Of course not. We haven't seen much meaningless content being communicated, at least through the politicians. But when we looked at the content, we were able to also identify a number of communication styles that seem to correlate with higher gains. And stripping away all technical academic jargon, I want to give you 5 things to take away from that communication styles that you can personally take, hopefully, to your next adventure, which might also be useful for you. So, what seems to be successful? The first thing is, I'm going to call that authenticity. Authenticity can mean very different things, of course, under very different contexts. It's an overhyped, overused word. But in the context of our research, it reflects original content, being able to create your own content as opposed to retweeting and relying on somebody else's content. We saw politicians who were able to create their own original content to generate greater returns compared to others. 2, inclusive language. And I think that is pretty straightforward in itself. Inclusive language implies the use of we, us, our, as opposed to I, me, my, right? Here is an example of a recent tweet from Tim Cook where he is talking about, again, not the Apple brand, not himself as the manager, but the teams within Apple, our teams, our engineering group, our design. And here again, if his constituency is his own employees, he's doing a great job in terms of communication. 3, directed communication. Directed communication, again, can mean very different things. But in this context of social media, right, one of the unique features of social media is that we are not communicating through a monologue. We are communicating in directed ways. There's a chance to, as a politician, there's a chance to get a comment from an ordinary citizen, and I can't have a directed communication, including many others later as well. We saw the politicians who were able to take advantage of such communication, the ability to respond, the ability to elevate the statements from others to generate greater returns. So again, what does this look like in the context of perhaps a former businessman? Here I see Bill Gates, again, one of the tweets that he generated recently, taking the content from Modi, directly citing Modi, referencing and elevating the content through his own original input, and being able to, again, generate directed communication. This also allows individuals to be able to benefit from the audiences of others, right? So that's, in that sense, that's also useful. 4, perhaps not too surprising, given that we're talking about information, if you're able to squeeze in more information in a more dense format, expand the information that you're given, you're also able to generate greater returns. What does that look like? It might look like in the context of a tweet, in terms of, the squeezing more information. It might mean adding an image. It might mean adding a link. It might mean referencing a document that individuals can go and learn more information about. So if you can squeeze in more information, we have seen that that also correlated with greater returns. This is also, by the way, a well-known thing in the world of advertising, right? There are brands who do this very successfully. They are labeled as sage brands. They create social media accounts, and they are constantly disseminating information about their product categories, the exclusive things about their product and some of the production materials. And this way, they are able to create a loyal audience, a loyal follower base that again, love and are hungry for this type of information. Finally, right, of course, sentiment, the feelings, positivity, negativity, anxiety, the emotions that we reflect in the content also can make a difference. In the context of our research, we did not find a particular sentiment becoming at least being associated with highly generated, highly successful political return, but we know that sentiment can matter in other contexts. Sentiment can matter in charitable contexts, charitable giving, it can matter in nonprofit organizations. So when you're creating content on social media, paying attention to sentiment can also be quite useful. So I wanted to leave you with these findings, right? The takeaways are, if you're interested in creating your new breaking brand, right? The new entrant, new next successful brand. If you're trying to develop your personal brand as a public figure or breaking into politics, I'm sure there will be many in this room whom we might see as a political figure in the future. especially in markets that tend to suffer from incumbency advantage, especially in regions, especially in product markets where there's a successful player who is already doing a great job. Using social media as a communication tool can be beneficial. But not just doing that, right? Taking away or taking advantage of some of the aid, right? The authenticity, inclusive language, directed communication, expanding information and sentiment in your communication tools that can potentially provide all those benefits can give you an advantage. So, of course, I would be a fool if I didn't leave you with some of my own recommendations, right? Here's my social media account and additional links that you can read about our research. But thank you so much for your attention.